Back in the quiet folds of the 18th century, a thing of peculiar luxury and utter inconvenience jangled beneath women's dresses. It was part birdcage, part wearable architecture, part, why did anyone think this was a good idea? And fully fashionable. Meet the pannier. Now, pannier is French for basket, which is deeply fitting because these elaborate, hooped understructures quite literally turned a woman into the most chic picnic carrier at an aristocratic luncheon. Though instead of sandwiches, they carried air, awkward silences, and the weight of societal expectations, and maybe a metaphor or two for oppressive elegance lightly seasoned with powdered wigs. You see, the goal wasn't to make the dress longer, or even bigger in all directions. No, that would have been tame. The goal was to make it dramatically wider, specifically at the hips, like a teacup saucer met a sideways lampshade. The bigger the side span, the more you, dear fashionista of Versailles, showed your wealth, your refinement, and your sublime indifference to your own mobility. Imagine gliding through a drawing room with a personal wingspan of 6 feet. Narrow doorways became mini challenges. Turning around required the spatial awareness of a pirate ship. And sitting down? Well, let's just say if parkour had existed, 18th century women would have excelled at the seated version. These hooped undergarments reached the peak of their horizontal ambition between the 1740s and 1760s. The noblewomen of France, England, Spain, and even the occasional German duchess wore them not only to court balls, but during dinners, childbirth, public executions, and, in one notable instance, to fetch a spoon someone dropped under the harpsichord, which took 45 minutes and 2 footmen. The very origins of the fashion are nestled in Spain, somewhere around the 16th century, where court dress was already enjoying a rebellious relationship with gravity. Spanish farthingales, earlier, sturdier hoop skirts, eventually evolved into the panniers of France, and from there expanded outward, literally and socially. By the time Marie Antoinette took the unofficial title of party CEO, the pannier was both a requirement and a statement. Let them eat cake, preferably behind me, because I block most sightlines. Construction-wise, a pannier was a marvel of minimalist engineering, if minimalist still means strapping whalebone ribs and linen reams to your torso. Some were split, with side panniers allowing for flatter fronts and dramatic hips. Others encircled the body entirely, those ones reserved only for state occasions, or small military parades hidden beneath. Tailors had to master the curve of fashion and physics. The larger the pannier, the more fabric was needed for the outer gown. A single dress could use up to 30 yards of silk. And that silk wasn't trudged out of some hobby shop. It came from the looms of Lyon, the treasure, chests of the East, winding trade routes tangled around empire and opulence, all so that Madame de Pompadour could resemble a walking ship in full sail at next Thursday's soirée. And yet, not one to trust rumors blindly. We are scholars here, if half asleep. Not all women wore them voluntarily. Many grumbled, silently. Others loudly, though seldom in public. Let's remember, this was a society where women couldn't vote or hold office, but they could obstruct doorways like trained professionals. Progress comes in many obscure silhouettes. But of course, with every strange trend comes a cast of clever critics, and none were cleverer than the satirical artists of the era. The Enlightenment wasn't just about reason, it was about drawing very rude cartoons. Pamphlets circulated with mocking illustrations of women wedged between furniture or using their panniers as makeshift dinner tables for inattentive husbands. One showed a man trapped in the flare of his wife's dress, yelling, "Save me! I thought it was a gazebo!" Still, the pannier endured, strangely beloved, bizarrely beautiful. It became a memory of an age where grandeur was measured in inches, sideways, and as you picture, the rustle of silk, the soft shush of crinoline whispering secrets to candlelit corridors. Let yourself settle into that slow, steady dream space where the world tilts a little, and even fashion obeys no laws but its own. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tomorrow, we'll step a little deeper into the whispery vault of absurd elegance, where fashion, fate, and slightly dangerous accessories always meet for tea. In the hazy dawn of the 16th century, when people still thought bathing more than once a month might summon demons, or worse, a cold fashion was quietly sharpening its elbows for one of its most aggressively impractical evolutions. The hourglass silhouette, that timeless figure of cinched waists and dramatic hip flare, was about to sashay into the spotlight, dragging a contraption along with it that looked like an architectural diagram and felt like a very polite prison. Enter the farthingale. Now you may be asking, somewhat sleepily, is that a garment or a bird? And while admittedly both are equally unwieldy in high wind, the farthingale was no bit of feathered fauna. It was a kind of hooped petticoat, stitched with structured bones, whalebone, cane, wire, or anything else that could be coaxed into a fashionable circumference. The name itself is one of history's sneakiest little puns. Farthing comes from the Old English for something small or coin-like, suggesting delicateness, which is ironic, because to wear one was to become a slow-moving, furniture-bumping, side-extending satellite of a person. The Spanish, fashionable and ever so fond of walking 5 paces ahead of everyone else, were the first to popularize the farthingale. As early as the late 1400s, Queen Joanna of Castile turned heads, partially because her skirt entered the room 10 seconds before she did. Her brand of farthingale was called the verdugado, likely named after the verdugo, or green wood rods used to stiffen the underskirt. It gave the gown a majestic, cone-like shape, perfect for making one's dignity physically unapproachable. And because nothing screams elite like inconvenience, the trend traveled north faster than a court gossip. The Tudor ladies of England, ever eager to adopt the mysterious customs of the continent, and maybe outgas the French, gave it their own spin under the watchful, corset-stiff gaze of Queen Elizabeth I. Her version of the farthingale grew more exaggerated by the year, expanding like a fashionable moon orbiting her ruling body. Imagine, if you will, attempting to pass through a narrow castle doorway while cocooned in a skirt the diameter of a dining table. Negotiating stairs became an Olympic sport. Sitting required the poise of a swan and the spatial awareness of a professional sailor. And heaven help you if your chamber pot was nearby, though I suppose if your garments encircle you wide enough, modesty receives some accidental assistance. And still, the farthingale conquered Europe. There was the French wheel farthingale, circular, stiff as a baking tray, and so broad it could quite literally clear a room. Picture a pancake made of taffeta and pride, radiating from the waist like solar flare. Across the channel, noble women wore these with self-serious expression and the gait of someone perpetually concerned they might catch fire on a candlestick. So you might wonder, why do all this? Why voluntarily transform into a slow-rotating carousel horse with ambitions of nobility? Because in the soft candlelit logic of fashion, your shape was your status. A small waist, flanked by vast architectural hips, was not only beautiful, it was symbolic. It meant you didn't have to labor, that your legs, like the rest of you, were purely ornamental, that you had people to open doors, or at least move the furniture. Larger skirts meant more fabric, and more fabric meant more wealth. The silhouette said, silently but splendidly, I am important, and I will block this hallway as long as I please. Yet, behind the grandeur, there was also more than just show. Underneath the scaffolding of boning and bustle, women found space, literal and metaphorical. In some eras, they hid pockets inside the hoops, an act of sartorial rebellion, tucking away letters, coins, or perhaps the occasional biscuit to survive interminable royal banquets. Still, not all appreciated the aesthetic or the absurdity. Male writers of the time, ever willing to grumble into their feathered quills, complained that the farthingales turned women into barrels or ships under full. A sail. But the women paid them no mind, sweeping nobly past like mobile fortresses of elegance, armed with lace ruffles and just enough steel to deter unsolicited opinions. And so, as candlelight flickers softly across the stone floors of another long-forgotten ballroom, the farthingale continues its slow spin through time. Part fashion, part fortress, entirely fabulous. Let us drift now, further into the layers, toward a time when someone said, "You know what this needs? More structure," and accidentally invented the corset. Let us now float gently, like a feather from a powdered wig, into the drawing rooms of 16th century Spain, where something rather magnificent and mysteriously geometric began to emerge beneath women's voluminous layers of velvet and brocade. Ah yes, this is where our story takes a rather structural turn, with the arrival of the farthingale. Now, if you're wondering what on earth a farthingale is, imagine one day waking up and deciding your dress should resemble the bottom half of a bell tower, or a portable table fit for a light tea service and several parakeets. That, dear listener, was the farthingale, a skirt support contraption that gave dresses an almost circular silhouette, constructed with hoops made of whalebone, cane, or, if you were feeling particularly ambitious, the kind of iron that could double as fencing equipment during a spontaneous duel. It began in Spain, likely around the 1470s, when someone decided that skirts must not just hang, they must command a room, quite literally. Known as the verdugado from the Spanish word verdugo, meaning rod or stick, this invention wasn't just a bold fashion statement. It was more like an architectural manifesto resting quietly beneath your hemline. Picture this: a noblewoman entering a room with her farthingale fully in bloom. Her hem swayed at a perfect circumference, forcing anyone in her path to reconsider both their position and their personal space. No need for elbows at courtly banquets. Your skirt already cleared the buffet line for you. One particularly delightful aspect of the farthingale was its capacity to signal class. If you wore one, it meant you had the luxury of space. Physical space, yes, but metaphorical space as well. Space to not do manual labor, space to be inconvenient on staircases, and space to deliberate for 30 minutes about whether you could, in fact, sit at all. Sitting, as it turns out, became less a casual motion and more of a synchronized descent involving mathematical precision and enough core strength to challenge any modern Pilates class. Women mastered an elegant squat and lift maneuver, with coaches, yes, actual hired tutors, devoted to teaching the art of sitting gracefully while entangled in what was effectively an upside-down chandelier. And yet, the discomfort, entirely worth it. Not only did it make waists look smaller, since your hips were now orbiting somewhere near Neptune, it also spoke volumes about your social relevance. The wider the skirt, the higher the risk of knocking over flower vases, the better. Now, you might ask, did everyone fall in line with this swishing halo of fashion? Of course not. There were critics. Tailors complained. Church officials nervously clutched their rosaries. How much closer to heaven must woman's skirt aspire? Moralists muttered darkly about excess and vanity. But the farthingale was not simply a dress cage. It was a paradoxical symbol of status and restraint. Henry VIII's sister wore one. Elizabeth I had farthingales so structured that it's a wonder she didn't require navigation charts for social functions. Even paintings from the time appear confused as to where the woman ends and the furniture begins. Perhaps the most poetic aspect of the farthingale is its quiet defiance of physics. Despite its girth and occasional metallic plumbing, it gave the illusion of lightness, billowing fabric, floating movement, an ethereal waltz through candlelit halls. Underneath was an engineering feat that would have made bridge builders nod in solemn respect. All this, bound up in pearls and lace. And yet, fashion moved on, as things always do. The round Spanish farthingale would eventually evolve, lurching toward the conical shapes of the French court, and then grow stranger still in later iterations. But in this quiet chapter of history, for a fleeting moment, architecture and elegance walked hand in hand, or hip in hoop. In the next breath of our dreamy journey, we'll glide toward a time when fashion's understructures took a sharp turn, literally, into shapes that could smuggle a small cottage beneath a gown. But for now, rest here, in the gentle bell of a satin skirt, and let the whalebone sigh softly beneath moonlight. In the lavender haze of the 18th century, guidance for what to wear didn't come from TikTok influencers or Paris runways. No, fashion back then was more like a peculiar, kind of architectural engineering, minus the safety codes. At the spiritual heart of this structural pursuit was the pannier, a word that sounds like a charming pastry, but was, in fact, a metal contraption designed to make your hips look like the wings of a grand piano. Imagine you've just been invited to court at Versailles. You've brought your politeness, your powdered face, and your most diplomatic smile. But the star of the show truly is your dress. Well, no. It's the gigantic, body-altering scaffolding under your dress, stretched wide like the sails of a galleon preparing to circumnavigate a ballroom. Panniers, from the French word for baskets, began innocently enough. At first, in the 17th century, they were small hip pads sewn into skirts to give a ladylike silhouette, a bit of a flirtatious boost for one's sideways presence. But then came the 18th century, and suddenly looking like a walking teacup wasn't enough. You had to look like the entire tea service. The fashion world thought, why stop at subtle flair when you could architect a dress that told courtiers across the room, I am wealthy, elegant, and have not passed through a doorway head-on in years. At its peak, in the mid-17th century, panniers were so massive that a woman could turn sideways and occupy the entire width of a chaise lounge. Dinner parties required strategic seating. Coaches had to be modified. And there are documented tales, delightfully ridiculous, of ladies riding sideways in carriages like awkward furniture, just so their dresses could fit inside. Fabric, too, had to adapt. A dress could require over 20 yards of silk just to glide serenely over those metal hoops, stitched and pinned into an upside-down basket frame that cradled your hips like they were fragile objets d'art. And the workmanship. Oh, the workmanship. The pannier itself could resemble an upturned birdcage, supported by whalebone, cane, or steel rods, and tied delicately around. The waist with ribbons that doubled as traps if tightened during too enthusiastic a curtsy. No one quite knows why humanity decided fashionable should feel like living inside a collapsible camping tent, but here we are. Now, you might think, surely everyone participated in this theatre of the absurd? Not quite. The pannier was mostly reserved for court dress, that is, clothing worn among royalty or assumed deities in powdered wigs. There, fashion was an elaborate form of communication. Wearing enormous panniers meant you were important. You required not only personal space, but a small team of assistants and at least one apology from your upholsterer. Queen Marie Antoinette mastered this look, of course. A vision in white, ruffled silk with a skirt that could moonlight as a billiards table. She strolled the Hall of Mirrors like a ship of state, slowly and with caution, lest her hip bones clip priceless furniture. But not everyone adored the trend. Satirical prints, the memes of the 1700s, ridiculed women attempting to pass through narrow gates or getting stuck in doorways. One image shows a lady drifting perilously close to an open window, her panniers catching a draft and threatening to lift her gently off the ground like an overdressed hot air balloonist. Still, for all their restrictiveness, the panniers offered one hidden gift: stability. Like a fortified skirt, women could lean against their own clothing during hours of standing, which sounds far more appealing than the spike-heeled tortures of our own era. And while movement was severely limited, the wide skirts also created a visual cue that said, I'm so well off, I don't have to move quickly for anyone. Of course, fashion is never immune to gravity, cultural or literal. By the late 1700s, panniers began to deflate. Revolutions have a way of making people suddenly interested in pragmatism. As the guillotine gleamed, the pendulum of style swung back towards sanity. The metal cages disappeared, and simpler silhouettes emerged, perhaps guided by the modest hope that one's outfit shouldn't require a floor plan and 2 footmen. But for a blink in history, a frilly, ribbon-tied blink, the pannier reigned supreme, lifting skirts, expectations, and eyebrows in drawing rooms across Europe. And just beyond the dreamy rustle of silk and the creak of whalebone, a new silhouette was already waiting, tighter, taller, and tucked with size, in the flickering candlelight of the late 1500s, in a chamber that smelled vaguely of lavender and melted beeswax. A woman might begin her day, not with a stretch, but a series of strategic negotiations, with gravity, geometry, and 15 pounds of understructure. You see, we have now entered the glorious reign of the farthingale. Ah yes, the farthingale. Equal parts fashion statement, personal privacy fence, and low-key torture device. Picture a bell-shaped skirt jutting out with regal determination, supported not by layers of fabric alone, but by rigid hoops of whalebone cane, or, if you were particularly wealthy and unbothered by comfort, steel. It was the 16th century's solution to one of life's most pressing questions. How can I walk into a room and ensure everyone must scoot dramatically to the sides? Originating in Spain and eventually traipsing its way to the courts of England and France, the farthingale allowed women to occupy more physical space than any man dared. Imagine trying to sidestep through a narrow castle corridor with a miniature fence strapped to your waist. It wasn't just about making a fashion impression, it was about asserting presence in a world not particularly inclined to give women much literal or figurative room. But what, you may wonder, was it like to actually wear one? Let's drift into the dream of a noblewoman's morning routine in Elizabethan England. She sits calmly while servants, who are roughly as overworked as a modern barista on a Monday morning, assemble her garments like architectural engineers. First, the chemise, essentially a nightgown that never got invited to rest. Then, the stays, not quite a corset yet. Think of it more as a glorified, lace-up breadboard designed to flatten and stiffen the torso, because apparently breathing was optional. Next comes the bum roll, which sounds uncomfortably like a medieval snack, but was in fact a soft, padded tube tied around the hips to bolster the skirt. But wait, we're just getting started. Now, bring on the farthingale. It's not unlike donning a collapsible pup tent around your legs. Wood or whalebone hooping sewn into the fabric ringed outward, like a tiered cake or a very ambitious lampshade. Together, these layers transform the wearer into a sweeping architectural marvel, a mobile monument to status. Not to mention an object with so wide a radius, she needed to turn sideways to go through doorways, and backsides accidentally took out side tables with alarming frequency. Now you might ask, was any of this comfortable? Well, no. But was it spectacularly impractical and therefore, in the fashion logic of the time, glorious? Absolutely. To be sure, there were benefits. One could hide entire loaves of bread, secret letters, or a smuggled hedgehog beneath those skirts. There are even whispered tales of court ladies hiding flasks of liquor long before handbags were invented. And where else might a woman command an entire circumference of personal space at all times? Even in our modern world, that seems like wizardry. Of course, fashion has never existed in a vacuum. The farthingale wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a performance of wealth and social prominence. Such cumbersome grandeur told the world, I don't work, I don't walk fast, I have servants, I have staircases large enough to accommodate this absurd circle of dignity. It was fabric as non-verbal persuasion, hoop as high society. Naturally, the more extreme the form, the more polarizing. Court whispers fluttered over whether the Queen's farthingale was audacious or majestic. Meanwhile, gentlemen offered arms to help noblewomen step over puddles, Though, truthfully, often they just wanted to peer beneath the layers, not realizing they were staring into a small, humid wardrobe chamber that trapped heat and, occasionally, live moths. Fashion critics of the era, who were essentially grumpy men writing overly dramatic letters, sniffed that the whole thing was unholy. One declared that the hoops resembled sugar loaf tents worn by vain women who feared simplicity. That mistrust of the farthingale's mystery, that it could conceal so much, was telling. Because what's more terrifying to a status quo than a well-dressed woman with secrets? Eventually, of course, silhouettes evolved. The farthingale gave rise to its awkward cousin, the French wheel farthingale, which looked like someone balanced a tabletop on a woman's hips. A fine innovation, really, if one needed a portable brunch surface. But those transitions are their own sleepy adventure. For now, let's sigh gently at the thought of rustling skirts, creaking hoop skirts, tapping down stone corridors, and the soft whisper of a woman's unstoppable silhouette sweeping through history. In the candlelit quiet of the royal dressing room, gowns ripple, servants yawn, and the farthingale stands victorious, unchanged, enormous, and magnificently in the way. Somewhere beyond the tapestries and embroidered sleeves, another transformation beckons. Something narrower, perhaps, but just as delightfully inconvenient. Somewhere in the flickering candlelit salons of the mid-17th century, a curious sound could be heard as a lady entered the room, an elegant creaking, like a well-oiled ship rolling into harbour, accompanied by the whispers of silk and polite gasps. Behold, the pania. No, not a breed of exotic bird, though that would explain the flapping. The pania, French for basket, and indeed inspired by them, was a gloriously impractical understructure worn beneath a woman's skirt. Think wide. Now think wider. Now imagine needing to walk sideways through a door like a fashionable crab. The pania was a metal or whalebone framework, sometimes padded, that extended the sides of a gown to heroic widths while keeping the front and back relatively flat. A proper silhouette for any woman hoping to resemble a mobile sideboard. And like all great oddities of history, the pania had purpose. Or at least, it had pretensions of purpose. A wide skirt created a commanding silhouette at court, making the wearer impossible to ignore, or even pass by without a complex maneuver. It said, "I am here, I am wealthy, and I brought my own furniture." In truth, it was never about convenience. These structures were architectural feats. Whalebone, also known as baleen, was prized for its flexibility, functioning much like the steel boning of a corset, only now distributed in glorious arcs below the waist. Some panniers were so wide they could reach 6 feet across. That is not a metaphor. One could easily smuggle a modest harp beneath such a gown, perhaps even refreshments for a small gathering. They created their own gravitational field of etiquette. When a lady wearing panniers approached a doorway, and many did eventually, she had no choice but to enter sideways. This was called crabbing, and it became an accepted movement at court. When she wished to sit, complex geometry took over. Benches were preferred to chairs, and still her dress might billow across an entire diplomatic conversation like a silken tarp. Now, not all panniers were 6 feet of lateral ambition. The grandest were worn at court, especially in Versailles under Louis XV and Louis XVI, where opulence was less about practicality and more about proving you didn't need to be practical. If your dress made it hard to sit, walk, or breathe, that simply proved you had other people to do those things for you. The wider the pannier, the higher your status, and higher still went the powdered wigs, which sometimes held entire scenes of naval victories. It was an age where fashion was not about individuality, but about impersonating wealth so convincingly that wealth itself might nod from across the ballroom and say, "Ah, I see we have much in common, madame." There were quieter forms of panniers worn in more modest social settings, called hip pads or false hips. These were more forgiving, like the yoga pants of Rococo. Still structured, still puffed, but you wouldn't need to scale a harp to embrace someone. Of course, not everyone found panniers delightful. Satirists had a field day. British newspapers caricatured French ladies as walking birdcages or teetering tables. Pamphlets imagined men being crushed in surprise embraces or trapped under accidental tenting. And there were real consequences. Some women reportedly got stuck indoors. A few knocked over decorative urns worth more than small nations. There's even a tale, perhaps embroidered with time, of a lady whose panniers caused her to take up both sides of a carriage ride, leaving her intended suitor to ride on top with the luggage like an overly perfumed travel case. But despite the absurdities, they were undeniably beautiful. The gowns that perched upon panniers were marvels of embroidery and lace. Hand-stitched flowers trailed like vines across acres of silk. Ribbons spiraled down fabric, so fine it whispered secrets when it moved. And beneath it all, a set of metal hoops, ensuring every step felt like wading through elegance and architecture. Eventually, the fashion faded, as even architectural misadventures do. The French Revolution, with its remarkably poor sense of humor about aristocratic hoops, ushered in the end of the panniered age. And so, the salons grew narrower, the skirts slimmer and doors, ever perfectly sufficient once more. But for a charming season in the 18th century, to walk into a ballroom and part the crowd not with status nor scandal, but sheer circumference. What a time that must have been. And tucked gently into the folds of fashion's next phase, something new was quietly rustling into shape, just beyond the seams. Back in the mid-1800s, people were not merely wearing clothes to be clothed. Oh no. They were staging full architectural showcases on their own bodies, particularly the women, who had the distinct daily challenge of dressing not just for the occasion, but for structural stability. Enter the crinoline, the 19th century invention that whispered, why simply wear a dress when you could wear a fashionable birdcage instead? Now let's clarify, the crinoline was not some innocent petticoat. It was essentially a hoop skirt framework made of steel or whalebone, designed to support the enormous bell-shaped skirts that were all the rage amongst fashionable ladies who apparently desired to resemble mobile teacups. It was light enough to carry in theory, but became unwieldy the moment you needed to walk through a doorway that wasn't engineered with equine carriages in mind. What some called silhouette enhancement, others might rightly call portable fencing. Crinolines flared outward in all directions, expanding the skirt so much that women needed to relearn basic physics. Sitting down, a high-stakes mission. Climbing stairs, an Olympic sport. Getting into a carriage, about as graceful as trying to fold a deck chair made of metal ribs and Victorian angst. Yet, despite the daily gymnastics and spatial negotiations, Victorian ladies wore these iron halos with, yes, some complaints, but also great unironic pride. Because back then, fashion wasn't just a personal expression, it was a social statement. It told the world, behold, I am wealthy enough, idle enough, and sufficiently surrounded by housemaids that I can afford to wear something that turns every room entrance into a geometry problem. It's also important to remember that, in a peculiar way, the crinoline was liberating. Relatively speaking, of course. Women had spent centuries bound up in layers of heavy petticoats and linens. Compared to all that steaming textile bulk, the crinoline's cage-like structure actually offered more ventilation. The dress fabric draped artfully over the hoops, allowing air to circulate and, just perhaps, making fainting spells only mostly due to the corsets. And speaking of corsets, a loyal companion to the crinoline, these stayed strapped onto ribs nationwide. While the crinoline expanded sideways like a blooming parasol, the corset cinched the waist into an hourglass, narrow enough to get one stuck sideways behind a divan. The contrast was the objective. Your waist should look so tiny that a lady's teacup might find it roomy. Of course, no good fashion moment is without a touch of chaos, and the crinoline era was no exception. Fireplaces posed a unique hazard. A lady could turn too sharply while toasting a crumpet and find her hoop skirt combusting with alarming theatricality. The newspapers of the time reported thousands of deaths by accidental crinoline conflagration, often with a tone that hovered somewhere between concern and unseemly fascination. And then there was wind, nature's playful trickster. A strong gust could reduce a crinoline to a parasail, lifting one side and exposing more than just ankles. Victorian decorum was not designed for sudden ballooning, and the poor ladies caught in the breeze often found themselves momentary Mary Poppinses, being flung about town with their dignity trailing behind them like a damaged valance. Still, with all their hazards and hindrances, crinolines achieved something significant. They quite literally made space for women. Physically, that wide skirt meant others around you had to step back. In a world where women were expected to shrink, politely, modestly, bodily, this was a quietly revolutionary expansion. You couldn't ignore a woman wearing a crinoline. She came with her own personal radius. Eventually, like all ridiculous yet gloriously human inventions, the crinoline faded from favor. Bustles replaced hoops, skirts collapsed inward, and the fashionable silhouette evolved once again. But for a shimmering moment in history, fashion dared to say, yes, this skirt is unwieldy, possibly flammable and wholly impractical. But isn't it magnificent? And as fashions shifted forward into new kinds of impractical, sometimes heavy, sometimes flighty, occasionally underwire-strewn creations, one couldn't help but wonder, what would they dream up next? Perhaps something slightly more climbable. Or perhaps not. With evening gently settling like lace over cobblestones, let's begin our tranquil stroll toward the next intriguing corner of fashionable absurdity. At the height of 18th century fashion, the silhouette of the ideal woman resembled something like an extremely elegant bell with a secret. And that secret? It was made of sturdy whalebone, flexible steel, and sheer social obligation. Yes, we are speaking of the pannier, a French word directly translating to basket, because apparently fashion did not shy away from labeling itself accurately back then. This curious device was essentially a wide hoop skirt frame that expanded horizontally at the hips, allowing the fabric of a gown to drape like two grand theatre curtains. From a front or back view, the effect was dazzling. From the side, well, it looked a bit like someone wearing a sideways shipping crate under silk. And oh, how panache met pragmatism and promptly parted ways. The pannier was a triumph of sartorial geometry. For the privileged few who could afford it, and the household staff to manage it, it transformed the act of entering a room into a performance. Doors had to be approached at angles, chairs carefully calculated. One did not merely sit, one executed a maneuver. Ballrooms were adapted, furniture rearranged, and carriages offered their own form of slapstick slapdashery. Designers had to devise innovations just to allow these architectural fashion contraptions into vehicles without dismantling their wearers, or the carriages themselves. Consider, if you will, the famous story of Marie Antoinette, practically a patron saint of the exaggerated pannier. During court gatherings at Versailles, her dresses were so wide that she once reportedly caused an elaborate porcelain vase to shatter simply by turning around. Whether this is true or just a delicious myth whispered by court gossips with nothing better to do, we may never know. But it certainly sounds plausible. Panniers weren't merely about size, though. They were embedded with a strange sort of language. The width of your skirt could quite literally reflect your wealth, your status, even your husband's job, or how much he didn't mind you looking like an elaborately decorated sideboard. Court dresses at times reached up to 8 feet across. That's 8 feet of fabric, boning and fierce commitment to fashion before function. The gowns themselves followed the contour of these skeletal frames, cascading down in elaborate waves. Silks, satins, brocades, trimmed with ribbons, embroidery, and so much lace that it was rumored entire forests of bobbins worked year-round just to keep up. And let's not forget the paradox of movement. While women in panniers glided regally across parquet floors, looking like ethereal ships cutting through candlelight, their underpinnings were doing something closer to mild dueling with reality. You couldn't really bend forward. Dancing was best attempted with choreography that resembled defensive fencing. Heaven help you if you drop something. But here's the cozy irony. The pannier, this great, sweeping framework, was often worn not all day, but specifically for court appearances and ultra-formal events. Most women had smaller, more maneuverable versions for daily life, unless of course one's daily life involved being painted, powdered, and ogled by visiting dukes. Underneath that theatrical silhouette, a hidden world of ties, tapes, and shifting weight distribution worked tirelessly to prop up the illusion of effortless grace. Wearing one could be an engineering feat rivaled only by cathedral scaffolding. Still, there was a certain magic in it. You'd stand tall, cinched at the waist, wide at the hips, like a human hourglass deliberately turned sideways. Your figure no longer belonged to mere anatomy. It was dictated by trends, architecture, and powdered court whisperings. It is said that when an English woman entered a Parisian salon in a dress just barely 2 feet across, the French sniffed that she looked positively undressed. To them, modesty didn't mean hiding your shape. It meant expanding it so flamboyantly and impractically that no actual human activity seemed possible while wearing it. That, clearly, was decency. But change, as it often does, hovered like a candle's flicker at the edge of all this grandeur. Whispers of comfort began infiltrating the salon. Ideas of reform, of revolution, of waistlines that didn't demand metal reinforcements and the occasional carpenter. And nestled in the folds of that excessive elegance, just beyond the stiff boning and embroidered hem, a new shape was already dreaming. Something simpler, perhaps. Something that could at last fit through a doorway without having to apologize to the wallpaper. But let's save that transformation for next time, when the crinoline returns. And this time, it's even more determined. If you've ever wondered what it might be like to live your life inside a birdcage, wearing a corset, while pretending nothing is unusual whatsoever, welcome to the curious, our world of 18th century fashionable architecture. Not the kind with bricks and chimneys, mind you, but the kind that converts your lower half into a mobile gazebo. By the mid-17th century, the grand performance of polite society had reached a unique crescendo. At the center of this sartorial symphony stood a wide, ambitious structure known fondly, and somewhat ominously, as the panier. From French for basket, panniers were rigid side hoops worn under a skirt, making the silhouette of a woman resemble, quite accurately, a sideways doorway, or perhaps a dinner buffet with ankles. Naturally, it all began with the aristocracy, whose two favorite things were being extravagantly uncomfortable and making sure everyone else noticed. The court of Louis XV, ever committed to the principle that more is always more, fully embraced panniers as the foundation, literally and metaphorically, of high fashion. The wider the pannier, the more wealth implied. Some gowns were so vast one might suspect they contained an entire, lesser, noble family underneath. But let's not be hasty. These weren't just frivolous whims of indulgent nobility. No. These architectural wonders served very clear, very practical purposes. Namely, indicating that a lady was so wealthy and exalted, she did not and would not have to do anything, such as walk through a narrow door, or sit in any conventional manner, or turn around in a hallway without taking out a chambermaid or a priceless vase. Imagine gliding gracefully, because you must always glide, through the palace ballroom, skirts stretching like the wingspan of a social peacock, carefully calculated to convey inconvenience. The language of grandeur is apparently spatial occupation, but real trouble arose when these hoop petticoats left the court and infiltrated the streets. Not cobbled back alleys, of course, but the polished parlors of the urban elite, who suddenly found themselves having to navigate carriages, door frames, and drawing rooms while wearing 12 feet of personal radius. Ladies developed the remarkable agility of turning sideways through doors with the practiced ease of a seasoned crab. Tables were rearranged. Hugs were discouraged. Tea was sipped with careful wrist flicks, lest the teapot go careening off the skirt's vast incline. And the question loomed, where exactly does one put a pannier when it's not being worn? Servants often hung them from pegs like equestrian gear, or folded them down with the practiced resignation of someone acquainted with the futility of rebellion. Storage closets expanded rapidly. And so, surprisingly, did social satire. Cartoonists of the day had a field day drawing caricatures of women toppling over, or men using the wide skirts as tables. One influential engraving showed two ladies so wide they couldn't converse without the assistance of a long speaking trumpet and a mirror. Even tradespeople got creative. Milliners installed wider shop doors. Carriage makers modified entrances to accommodate 70 inches of aristocratic splendor. Influencers of the time, known as duchesses and marquises, helped spread styles that would eventually evolve into even stranger forms of structural fashion innovation. Of course, not everyone was delighted. Moralists fretted over the apparent vanity. Economists grumbled at the sheer volume of silk. Clergy whispered that perhaps skirts shouldn't be measured in square footage. But as we've seen throughout history, the louder the critics complain, the taller the wig, or in this case, the wider the pannier. Eventually, practical reality began to nibble away at the edges of fashion, as revolutions whispered in coffeehouses and full skirts became symbolic targets of excess. The pannier wobbled toward retirement, not with a bang, but with a gentle sidestep. By the end of the century, skirts had narrowed, and stairs once again became navigable. Still, the ghost of the pannier lingers in the vast closets of our cultural memory. There's something so charming, so hypnotically absurd about a time when women walked around like sideways ships in full sail. Tonight, as your mind wanders through candlelit halls and the soft rustle of taffeta echoing off marble walls, imagine the quiet choreography required to make it all seem graceful. A small army of pins, a determined sense of balance, and perhaps, beneath it all, a weary sigh that said, "At least it's not another corset." And speaking of corsets, perhaps next we'll loosen a few laces and take a peek at what really went on under those tightly cinched bodices. Imagine, if you will, the rustle of satin, the scent of lavender sachets tucked beneath corseted chests, and the rhythmic clinking of fashion that could rival a marching band's percussion section. We are now waist deep, literally, in the clanky, confounding world of 18th century undergarments. And tonight, we shall become better acquainted with, perhaps, the strangest wardrobe companion of them all, the pannier. Now, you may be picturing something that sounds like a bicycle accessory. And yes, technically, it's named after the French word for basket, which makes perfect sense, considering it looked rather like your hips had gone grocery shopping and refused to come back inside. The pannier was an elaborate side hoop structure, worn under skirts, designed to extend the width of gowns outward, horizontally, mind you, so that from the front, one looked relatively slim, but from the side, one resembled a modestly adorned dinner table. As with many of history's more unhinged fashion statements, this too began with the aristocracy, who saw nothing wrong with adjusting their pelvic circumference to small boat dimensions in order to project an air of sophisticated discomfort. Courtly dresses in the 1700s expanded to dramatic widths, sometimes requiring doorways to be entered sideways and conversation to involve carefully lobbed glances rather than turns of the head. The structure of the pannier was made of fabric panels supported by hoops of whalebone cane or metal. That meant you weren't just dressing fashionably, you were also effectively installing minor architectural features beneath your clothing each morning. It took time. It took effort. It took patience. Not just from the wearer, but from any person who had the misfortune of trying to share a carriage, a pew, or a dance floor with such a magnificently wide person. Of course, aristocrats didn't mind. A gown so vast that it required its own postal code whispered gently, and sometimes rather loudly, of luxury. After all, if your outfit made it impossible to do your own dusting, kneel in a chapel, or flee from your third arranged marriage, surely you had people to do these things for you. Attending a ball or a royal function, women would glide, shuffle, into the room, their enormous skirts swaying grandly from side to side, each movement orchestrated like the sails of a ship catching just the right breeze. To dine, you needed to have a wide enough seat, chairs possibly imported from more understanding nations, and woe betide the gentleman who attempted to whisper sweet nothings to his betrothed across the table, only to find that her pannier had physically placed her 3.5 feet to the left of where her face normally resided. But it wasn't all silks and scaffolding. Panniers were also a social signaling device. The size of your hips, not necessarily a matter of musculoskeletal design, it was fashion's most elaborate humble brag. The wider the pannier, the more influence you likely had at court, with some gowns stretching to 6 feet across. That's roughly the wingspan of a modest eagle, or a particularly stylish gull. For those not at Versailles, though, practicality reared its sensible little head. Working women, farmers' wives, weavers, washerwomen, chose sanity over style, opting for simpler, more mobile garments. Yet the influence of the pannier trickled down. Smaller hoops and modest side padding became popular, so that even outside the ballroom, one could suggest, flirtatiously, that they were inconveniently wide-hipped for the season. In time, as fashions do, the pannier's moment crested and fell. By the late 18th century, with revolutions bubbling and heads soon to roll, nobody wished to look that aristocratic. To be able to duck quickly, run swiftly, or dart away inconspicuously became suddenly fashionable, rendering the pannier more of a liability than a luxury. Still, for that brief sparkling moment in history, society dared to go sideways. Fabrics flounced in architectural wonder. Fashion declared, why not be beautiful and impossible to sit close to? It was an age where social standing could be measured in inches, from hip to hip, and grace was found in the kind of balance typically reserved for tightrope walkers and medieval bridge builders. What came next? Well, let's just say fashion wasn't done being inconvenient. Because while the pannier faded, another cage was waiting in the wings. Taller, rounder, and with a name that sounds suspiciously like a baking instrument. But we'll turn quietly in its direction next and let the rustle of history guide us. The year was somewhere between let's all wear absurd amounts of fabric and let's sculpt ourselves into furniture, which is to say, mid-18th century Europe. By now, panniers had reached a kind of comedic peak. The once modest side hoops had become architectural statements. Dresses no longer flowed, they presented. Ladies of high society now glided sideways through doorways, their skirts fanning out like miniature European wingspans. For the uninitiated, a pannier looked like 2 picnic tables strapped to your hips. For the initiated, it was 2 picnic tables strapped to your hips, and you hoped Margaret wasn't wearing the same model. What began as a practical little understructure to hold out fabric had somehow evolved into a full-fledged silhouette war. Aristocratic women now competed in dimensions, not just diamonds. The wider the gown, the higher your status, or at least, the more people had to clear furniture for you. Elevating yourself socially, it turned out, required not only the right family background, but also several feet of steel-reinforced whalebone jutting from your pelvis. And let's talk about logistics, shall we? Walking was a practice in strategic diplomacy. Every room required mental mapping. Narrow staircases, sharp corners, and crowded ballrooms transformed into obstacle courses with delightful opportunities for collision. Conversations often began with an apology and ended with an ankle bruise. Not yours, but the unsuspecting footman you'd unwittingly bludgeoned with your petticoat peninsula. Sitting was no easier. Chairs had to be approached like puzzles. You couldn't simply lower yourself. You had to reverse engineer a descent path, factoring in hoop width, floor friction, and cushioning depth. In theatres, royal boxes provided enough room, but in private drawing rooms, taking a seat meant choosing between elegance and dislocation. And yet, these structural marvels weren't merely fashion, they were symbols. During a time when most people were more worried about bread than brocade, the ability to wear a dress that doubled as a small gazebo was as much about not needing to work as it was about beauty. The visual message was clear. I don't lift anything heavier than silk. I cannot possibly fit into a carriage with commoners, and I certainly won't be tending any goats today. A pannier wasn't just a style. It was a social force field, a hoop-skirted declaration of leisure and distance. Fashion illustrators tried their best to keep up, though even they occasionally threw in the quill. Some engravings from the time depict women with skirts, wider than they are tall. Proportions abandoned ship entirely. Posters began to look less like clothing guides and more like sailing diagrams. Wingspan, starboard petticoat, hull of lace, etc. Meanwhile, tailors and dressmakers, the unsung heroes of this fabric frontier, worked overtime. The skill required to drape, pleat, and attach miles of silk to an increasingly non-human chassis was immense. Some gowns required secret panels, trapdoors, and enough internal rigging to rival a maritime vessel. If you peeked under one of these dresses, you might see a cousin of the London Bridge. Men didn't escape unscathed either. While they weren't hoisting petticoat fortresses, they responded the only way fashion often allows, by compensating. Coats grew longer, wigs grew taller, and heels clicked louder. Everyone was playing the part of a walking sculpture. Flamboyance wasn't just allowed, it was costume code. And yet, amidst the grandeur there was, believe it or not, a touch of comedy. In letters and journals, ladies often joked about their clothes. One duchess quipped that she'd had to eat her soufflé sideways because her pannier knocked over half the tableware. Another claimed her dog had fit comfortably under one hoop during dinner and was only discovered the next morning, fast asleep. Even royalty embraced the awkwardness. Court etiquette at Versailles, already a ballet of bows and references, had to be adapted to avoid hoop entanglements. Picture hundreds of women moving in slow circles, trying not to clip each other while keeping proper eye contact. It was like synchronized swimming, but drier, and with wigs. But change, as always, was waiting quietly. And soon, as economies shifted and revolutions rustled their paper wings, the days of steel-cage silhouettes began to teeter. Just ahead, we'll drift into the mysterious role of fashion in courtly power, where necklines whispered secrets and brooches flashed allegiances. But for now, let the panniers float in your imagination like sailboats on a ballroom sea, gently gliding into sleep. In the grand symphony of 18th century fashion, where silks rustled like whispered secrets and ribbons fluttered like coy glances on a spring breeze, one peculiar trend rose quite literally above the rest: the towering, gravity-defying hairdo. These were not simply hairstyles. They were habitable ecosystems, engineering marvels. And quite possibly, the reason so many women had neck pain during the French Enlightenment. Around the 1770s, when dresses were shaped by steel and petticoats barely fit through doors, hairstyles decided to compete, not by slimming down, but by going up. Enter the pouf, a towering coiffure proudly perched atop the scalp, reaching often 2 feet or more into the Parisian sky, and giving entire city skylines a run for their money. The pouf wasn't simply a mound of hair. Oh no. It began as a sculpted mountain of powdered strands, stiffened with pomades, made from bear fat. Yes, bear fat, a standard part of any elegant woman's toilette, provided one had no strong opinions about the lingering scent of forest carnivore, and methodically stacked over cushions, wires, and pads. Basically, it was an architectural endeavor atop one's skull, one that might require its own permit in today's urban landscape. But what truly transformed the pouf into a Baroque conversation piece were the decorations. And here, dear listener, is where human creativity meets its highest and frankly oddest expressions. The hair became a stage, and anything could be its star. Bows, fruit, birds, pearls, model ships, yes, actual miniature ships with sails and rigging, and gardens with silk roses and occasionally live greenery. One noblewoman, perhaps in a peak of patriotic flair, or perhaps just really enjoying boats, installed a tiny model of a naval vessel in her coiffure to commemorate a French naval victory. Parisians whispered that gusts of wind carried the scent of saltwater when she walked by. Probably an exaggeration, or perhaps the bear fat just aged oddly. Now one might ask, how did one sleep with such a hairstyle? The answer is astoundingly straightforward. One did not. Or if one did, it was sitting up, perfectly still, like a fashionable vampire awaiting sundown. These hairdos could last for weeks if maintained, making personal hygiene decisions both strategic and limited. Hair had to be protected from the elements. Thus, women often wore large head coverings indoors, like delicate parasols for their scalps, to shield their creations from dust, precipitation, and the occasional low-hanging chandelier. Unsurprisingly, the Great Poof era created new challenges, namely vermin. Yes, some of these teetering towers of tress were warm and spacious enough to attract unwelcome guests, specifically lice, and in more dramatic, possibly apocryphal accounts, mice. There are whispered tales of noblewomen murmuring small prayers before bed that no creature stirred in their coiffure. Hairpins turned into weapons of self-defense, one poke for fashion, another for mice control. But before you despair for their dignity, remember that these ornate creations were often symbolic. A woman might encode political opinions into her hairstyle. A tiny shepherd with a crook could signify support for Marie Antoinette's pastoral fantasies. A collection of cornucopias could symbolize abundance or a recent harvest ball. The poof became a social media platform centuries before TikTok, broadcasting messages through feathers and fruit. There were even professional hairdressers, known as coiffeurs, who specialized in aeronautical styling. In fact, Monsieur Léonard, the personal hairdresser of Queen Marie Antoinette, gained such notoriety for his aerial artistry that he was considered a national treasure, or perhaps more accurately, a national enigma. One contemporary wrote that he spent hours constructing triumphs upon the Queen's head. Not arranging hair, constructing triumphs. Fashion, by this stage, had fully abandoned the idea of practicality and embraced a kind of performative absurdity. But perhaps that's part of its charm. In a world still brushing off medieval notions and cautiously peeking into the age of reason, what better way to declare one's enlightenment than with a literal enlightenment-shaped sun adorning your scalp? As dusk settled over Versailles and powdered wigs basked in the candlelight of endless dinners, the gentle rise and fall of poofed heads, nodding politely, or simply tipping under the weight, seemed almost tranquil. And so, as the hairstyles grew taller and the symbolism richer, fashion, yet again, reached toward the heavens, perhaps unaware of just how far it would fall. Now, take a soft breath and rest your thoughts with the quiet clip of candle snuffers, while the court prepares for its next curious obsession, one that would smell a little less of rose pomade and a little more like scandal, wrapped in embroidery. It was the summer of 1748, and somewhere in France, a seamstress quietly cursed her latest commission. Her client had requested a gown just wide enough to command a ballroom, but not enough to knock over candelabras. This, of course, was an impossibly fine line. The butter yellow silk was agreeable, the lace charming. But the structure, the dreaded panier, was as cooperative as a drunken goose. By now, the panier, as it was affectionately called, had grown into a fashionable menace. From its early roots as a modest understructure, straight off the hips, it had blossomed, or perhaps ballooned, into something better suited for launching a satellite than attending a tea. The panier was not a cage in the punitive sense, but it was, let's be honest, still very much a cage. Made from whalebone, cane, or metal, it created the iconic sideways span of Rococo. Dresses. You know the ones. The kind of gowns that look like a pastel aircraft carrier has docked beneath a very fancy fitted jacket. At its widest, a lady might span 6 feet across. That's not an exaggeration, that's a hazard. Occupational hazards abounded. Women learned to pivot gracefully through thresholds sideways. Ballroom choreography was negotiated like naval tactics. And carriages. Oh dear. Some had special compartments to accommodate the girth of society's most fashionable ferrygoers. Others simply had straps to hoist the pannier up like a drawbridge so the wearer could sit without being consumed by her own skirt. Despite these clunky logistics, the pannier was the star of any gathering. To wear one was to waltz around like a floating pastry cart, delicate, elegant, and entirely impractical for anything outside of standing still or possibly gently collapsing onto a velvet love seat. But as with all high fashion, impracticality was part of the point. Mobility was for peasants. Width was the new wealth. And make no mistake, this was architectural fashion. Architects of the era admired the structure. Really, François Boucher painted it. Poets wrote odes to it. Tailors plotted it on parchment like engineers. There were even court summaries dedicated to judging how tastefully, or not, a woman's girth entered a room. One wit at Versailles claimed that to measure favour at court was to measure inches, not of influence but of skirt span. Of course, not everyone was charmed. Satirists had their day, sketching cartoons of women flattening footmen against walls or being hoisted through windows. A famous image in an English pamphlet depicted 2 sumptuously dressed ladies gossiping, their gigantic skirts blocking the entire lane, while a humble man with a basket of turnips looked on, trapped and possibly rethinking his life choices. Yet the pannier endured. As with many elaborate fashions, once adopted by royalty and aristocracy, it took on the miraculous power of being both absurd and somehow entirely necessary. Marie Antoinette herself occasionally wore colossal versions, which were built to suggest grace, excess, and not a single thought about stairs. One must admire the women who wore them, not with reluctance but with flair. They developed an entire vocabulary of posture and poise, a graceful dip here, a correct angle of ascent up a carriage step there, and balancing tea while dressed like a confectionery windmill. That, dear listener, required a steely core not commonly credited to society ladies of the 18th century. As time tiptoed onward, narrower silhouettes started to win favor again. But for a glittering moment, fashion reached sideways instead of upward, and in doing so, created not just garments, but miniature stages. The pannier was not just about clothing. It was about space, spectacle, and the quiet declaration. I've arrived, and I brought a 6-foot radius of elegance with me. Now then, close your eyes. Imagine a candlelit ballroom filled with low laughter, powdered wigs, and skirts large enough to require licenses. Somewhere, a courtier miscalculates a turn and gently collides with a violinist. The music wobbles. No one seems to mind. After all, it's just fashion making room for itself. And just beyond the lacquered doors, something smaller, simpler, begins to hum in Parisian parlors. A whisper of resistance, of minimalism even. But before it takes hold, there is still time to meet one particular lady of fashion, her curious habits, and an incident involving a swan. In the golden hush of the 1850s, when trains puffed like overexcited teapots and Queen Victoria was still getting used to being on teacups, fashion took a sharp, and rather clanky, turn. The cage Crinoline had arrived. It sounded dramatic, as if it might belong in a Gothic novel, or perhaps some sort of bird-based fencing league. But no, the cage Crinoline was not a sport, nor an architectural feature, though it could support its own weather system on a windy day. Rather, it was a tidy little revolution made from steel hoops and invisible suffering. You see, up until that point, most women had bulked out their skirts using layers of stiff petticoats. That meant walking around all day in what was essentially a quilted triple mattress strapped to one's hips. Not exactly breathable, so when some clever minds, and likely overheated thighs, begged for mercy, along came the crinoline, light, airy, and, how charming, a little bit clangy. The earliest crinolines were inventions of convenience, wrapped in a whisper of deceit. They promised freedom from heavy petticoats, but delivered the controlled chaos of wearing a rolling chandelier. The real innovation came when designers began forging the skirt structure from steel. Yes, actual steel. As in, the thing ships are made of. Women were, without too much exaggeration, wearing collapsible bird cages as foundation garments. The effect was striking. Suddenly, skirts ballooned to proportions that could, with some effort, shelter a small family during a drizzle. Women occupied entire doorways. Tea parties required spatial negotiation. Suddenly, conversation turned not to needlepoint, but to geometry. "Don't sit too close, Margaret. My crinoline needs a solid 2 feet of clearance." Careful schematics aside, the cage crinoline did offer a bit of ventilation luxury compared to those leaden, multi-layered petticoat years, and perhaps most delightfully, it allowed legs to swing freely beneath, for the first time in a while. It's difficult to describe just how thrilling it must have been to breathe beneath your own skirt. Never mind that the sound of movement was now faintly musical, a soft jangle with every step like a one-woman percussion ensemble. Of course, such structural fashion brought on logistical opportunities. There are many whispered tales of women getting caught on furniture, tipping over like a poorly anchored umbrella, or accidentally sweeping entire tables worth of fine china to the floor with an ill-judged twirl. One lady famously knocked over a candelabrum in a ballroom and set fire to her own petticoat. The blaze was extinguished quickly, by several people hiding under the hoop for safety. But in her defense, it was quite a dramatic way to leave a party. On the other hand, the cage crinoline had unintentionally democratic tendencies. For the first time, women of less extravagant means could achieve the same magnificent silhouette without purchasing endless layers of white-laced hierarchy. All you needed was the cage and a reasonably willing waistline. It was, in a way, mass-producible elegance. Naturally, the gentlemen had their grievances. For one thing, kissing someone across a crinoline required both creativity and an advanced understanding of physics. Romantic proximity became a measured calculation. Approach at an angle, tilt the hat, prepare to lean, was fashionable courtship with a touch of naval maneuvering. The public sphere too had to recalibrate. Theatre seats were widened. Church pews adjusted. Carriages became a source of daily drama. Getting in required folding, scooting, and the occasional out-of-body experience. And then there was weather. Picture an open field, a gust of wind, and several crinoline-clad figures achieving spontaneous liftoff like parade balloons with petticoats. Ladies held their parasols tightly and prayed for ballast. But for all their blunders and breeze-induced exploits, the cage crinolines represented a moment in time when architecture met aesthetics in the most charmingly unnecessary way. So there she would go, a proper Victorian lady, clinking her way through the marketplace, skirts sweeping out like the wings of a grand social bird. Inside that dome of steel and cotton, she moved with the confidence only someone wrapped in 18 feet of circumference could command. But fashion, just like a well-worn corset, is never a permanent fit. Soon, new shapes would arise, and as the century marched forward, so did something even more shocking: simplicity. But that, as they say, is another story folded neatly in the next layer. Beneath the rustle of petticoats and the dignified clatter of corset busks, another curious contraption quietly revolutionized how 18th century ladies moved through the world, as if wrapped in their own architectural blueprint. Let us now observe the humble farthingale's flamboyant cousin, the panier, pronounced panier, which sounds suspiciously like something you might eat with brie. The panier was not edible, but certainly took up space like a well-fed goat. Emerging in the early 1700s, It was essentially a pair of side hoops, one perched on each hip, forming a silhouette so wide people could graze imaginary sheep beneath it. At first glance, the panier appeared to be an elaborate prank played by tailors. Picture a dress shaped like two teacup saucers strapped sideways to a woman's hips. But to those living through the age of powdered wigs and 5-foot-wide ballroom entrances, the panier was the leading edge of high society fashion. Its function was not merely to confuse physics, but, like many items in the historical sock drawer of fashion, to signify status. The wider the panier, the higher your place on the aristocratic ladder. After all, if your skirt could knock over a small child simply by turning too quickly, you had clearly made it in life. These side hoops were often made from whalebone, cane, or flexible steel, materials specifically chosen for their ability to be both springy and unforgiving. They were sewn into petticoats or attached via tapes and channels, creating an almost spring-loaded skirt silhouette. The result? A woman's dress could span 4 to 5 feet wide, but remain remarkably flat at the front and back, making walking through doorways a daily geometry lesson. And walk they did, with something between a glide and a crab-like maneuver. To enter a room sideways was common. To sit down, a theatrical event. You didn't so much take a seat as slowly approach one, hover like a spacecraft, and gently descend, hoping you would clear the sides and not crush someone's spaniel in the process. Servants learned quickly how to guide their mistresses through tight corridors. Carriages were customized, and if 2 women wearing full panniers met in a hallway, one of them usually had to reverse out like a Baroque bumper car on a narrow bridge. Despite the obvious logistics, the panier nation thrived for nearly a century. Royal courts embraced them with enthusiasm that seemed inversely proportional to practicality. At the French court, Madame de Pompadour and her associates could flash entire bolts of silk across their skirts, and tailors, wizards of ripstop fabric and stubborn wire, crafted elaborate gowns that blossomed like chandeliers from the waist down. Men were not completely immune to this horizontal enthusiasm. Though not donning side hoops themselves, they admired the effect, occasionally with the spiritual awe one reserves for bridges or opera houses. The appearance of these enormous skirts, framing a delicate waist like a tulip in bloom, was considered the very height of grace. But not everyone was taken. Satirists of the time affectionately mocked the trend, drawing cartoons of women getting stuck in doorways or being used as lunch tables. English pamphlets muttered about those French contraptions, suggesting that the panier was a fire hazard, a marriage hazard, and a spiritual hazard all in one. You had to admire the efficiency. Then there were the truly elite, whose court gowns were not simply wide. They were theatrical masterpieces. Consider a coronation dress with a 10-foot train, side hoops the size of tent canopies, and embroidery that sparkled like the night sky, all worn with the calm grace of someone who had 3 people helping her walk. And yet, despite its flamboyant reality, the panier served a deeper symbolic purpose. Its presence quite literally made space around a woman. It created a zone, a controlled perimeter of gentility. To enter that space was to be invited, to be held at a distance, a sign of deference. In a world where social order was stitched into the very seams of a gown, the panier was as much a social diagram as a fashion statement. But all metal cages must eventually bend beneath the pressure of innovation and discomfort. And as we drift closer into the next chapter of fashion's mechanical underpinnings, we begin to see the panier deflate, only to give way to something even more ambitious, and just as likely to poke a bystander in the ribs. As the 19th century waltzed ever onward, the crinoline, that bell-shaped parachute of social status, continued to swell with both fabric and farce. But just as fashion is nothing if not a pendulum attached to a lady's reticule, slowly the people began to whisper, "Perhaps this is all a bit much." And so enters the lesser-known and seldom celebrated phenomenon of the crinoline collapse of the 1860s. Not a violent collapse, mind you. No petticoat riots or hoop-based rebellions, but the slow pneumatic hiss of fashion deflating one absurd silhouette in favor of cultivating yet another. By this time, the crinoline's girth had reached comical proportions. Pass through a doorway. Only sideways, madam. Sit in a carriage. Not without spatial negotiations and a minor engineering degree. Attend the opera. Don't you dare sneeze, lest your dress topple the champagne tray 8 rows ahead. Society was being quietly, but unmistakably, squeezed. Popular satire caught wind, of course. Cartoons in Punch magazine featured entire families lost inside their mothers' underskirts, like children misplaced in shrubbery. Gentlemen swore they'd accidentally proposed to coat racks, and yet, despite all the lampoonery, the women persisted, gliding, maneuvering, and deploying their steel-woven garments with practiced grace and the occasional bruised shin. But the tides, ever fashionably late, did begin to turn. As cities grew more crowded and industrial smoke puffed through the air like overzealous cologne, practicality tugged at the hems of women's dresses. Medical professionals, particularly those alarmingly fond of Victorian pseudoscience, warned of the health dangers of wearing compressive contraptions. Evidently, turning the lower half of your body into a bell tower wasn't ideal for spinal alignment. Who would have thought? Enter the bustle. Ah yes, the bustle. A creased, padded cousin to the crinoline whose job was less support the entire skirt in a halo of metal, and more, hold up the rump like it's attending a gala in Paris. The fashion world was shifting, not letting go of elaborate femininity, but certainly rearranging it for easier exits and more practical flirtations. The bustle essentially moved the architectural project of dress support from the all-encompassing dome to a targeted region, specifically the derrière. Women no longer looked like inverted tulip bulbs. They now appeared as if they might be smuggling slightly overstuffed throw pillows beneath carefully ruched silk. A bit more concentrated, a tad more dramatic, and roughly half as likely to snag a doorknob on entry. This change didn't happen overnight. The late 1860s were a curious swirl of fashion indecision. Some women clung to crinolines like shipwreck survivors to floating barrels. Others embraced the bustle with a kind of gleeful relief. For a brief period there existed a strange in-between, crino-bustle hybrids with both volume and vertical lift, like dresses experiencing an identity crisis in real time. But the bustle offered newfound elegance. No longer mere circles on legs. Women took on serpentine silhouettes, trailing sashes and elegant ruffles. Across marble floors, their skirts whispering secrets to the parquet. It was a time of fashion redirecting itself, not shrinking exactly, but consolidating. Naturally, not all were impressed. Conservative critics looked at the bustle and declared it indecent. One pious journal worried that accentuating the posterior was a signal downfall in modesty, as if fabric could commit moral offenses. Meanwhile, others whispered that the bustle wasn't just a fashion support, but a statement, a playful wink at constriction, geometry, and the absurd expectations that society quietly enforced through steel boning and exaggerated silhouettes. Even Queen Victoria herself, who had once embraced the crinoline with regal commitment, stepped out with slightly more subdued skirts in her later years, as if to say, yes, we've all been colossal, but perhaps we shall now be only slightly preposterous. Manufacturers of crinolines shifted their business models with impressive agility. Some began crafting collapsible frames, others made miniature versions for children, because nothing says adorable like a 5-year-old in mild discomfort. A few savvy entrepreneurs even repurposed discarded crinolines into bird cages or laundry hampers. One can only hope the birds weren't offended by such associations. And so, as the 1870s approached, the age of the grand tea-cozy crinoline began to flutter, steel bones trembling into its gentle fade. The fashions would never quite be the same. They would continue to evolve, loop, and lurch forward, propelled by equal parts vanity, invention, and the quiet rebellion cloaked in lace. But before we drift completely into the age of bustles and subtle rebellion, there's a peculiar little chapter to uncover, one where gentlemen, ever so envious or perhaps bewildered, started meddling in the world of structured silhouettes themselves, as the sun set over the drawing rooms of 18th century Europe, fading in silken strokes. Through curtains so heavy they could double as winter blankets, it's safe to say that fashion remained completely and utterly unreasonable. But by this point, that was the point. Having already established that women were willing to wear structures under their clothes that could skewer a dinner guest if they turned too quickly, it should come as no surprise that more than one aristocrat found herself struggling, gracefully, of course, to fit through her own doorway. The fault lay at the feet, clad in delicate slippers, probably trimmed with sadness and imported lace, of a marvelous contraption known as the pannier. Now, pannier may sound like a delightful French pastry, the sort you'd order with a café au lait and a sigh of quiet romanticism. But no. A pannier, in fashion terms, is a wide metal or whalebone framework strapped around the hips, meant to make skirts flare horizontally like a marquee tent waiting for a garden party that never arrives. Panniers were less about walking and more about gliding, preferably on freshly polished parquet flooring. The idea was to showcase not only acres of embroidery and costly fabric, but also, quite frankly, one's ability to afford the burden of looking elaborate. The broader your skirts, the more you announced to the world that there was no need to stoop, bend, or perform any activity requiring basic spatial reasoning. You were above such things, 6 feet wide to be exact. This architectural miracle became especially popular at court, where the rules of behavior included not asking questions like, "How do I sit in this?" The answer, incidentally, was awkwardly, or if one could manage it, perched on the very edge of a chaise-longue like a particularly glamorous bird preparing for takeoff. And yet, practicality's loss was flattery's gain. With all the volume aimed outwards at the hips, the waist appeared cinched to near impossible slimness, an optical illusion so effective it might have made M.C. Escher put down his pencil and exclaim, "Enfin, fashion?" Of course, as with most styles of glorious inconvenience, the pannier required assistance. Dressing alone would have been like attempting to assemble a ship in a bottle while wearing mittens. Maids and dressers would help tie, hoist, and gently nudge their mistress through corridors, possibly brushing aside the occasional vase or footman. One could not simply sashay into a room. One had to plan the sashay with military precision. When seated, which ideally happened seldom, social etiquette dictated that skirts be carefully folded like a peacock resting from applause, and entering a carriage required either turning sideways or occasionally using custom-made doors. Some aristocrats travelled with collapsible panniers, an early nod to the modern miracle of folding furniture. Portable, still ridiculous, and with about the same dignity as parallel parking a grand piano. Fashion in this period was never merely about what you wore. It was what you silently proclaimed by your ability to endure it. Lavish garments and their structural underpinnings were conversations in textile form. They said, "I am wealthy enough to float effortlessly through this gilded maze of satin and sequins, even if I can't actually make it down a spiral staircase without a witness and a pulley system." And still, stubbornly stylish through every tight-laced breath and balancing act of courtly movement, women embraced the absurd. Because for better or worse, society rewarded the spectacular. And a pannier, wider than a dining table and stitched within an inch of its life, declared a woman not just fashionable, but formidable. Imagine it now. Candlelight flickering off gold-threaded brocade, laughter shimmering through fans and wigs tall enough to house a family of sparrows, and all around, the gentle rustle of skirts, the size of small planets. Somewhere amid this polite chaos, a duchess offers a curtsy that defies basic physics, and everyone nods approvingly, knowing full well she haven't sat down since Tuesday. But the story doesn't end here. No, after metal cages came softer revolutions. Quite literally. In the next Twilight chapter, something peculiar begins to shift. fashion, ever poetic and ever strange, starts to loosen its stays. Just a little. Imagine, if you will, that you're invited to a pleasant garden party in the English countryside around the year 1858. There are cakes in tower formations, lemonade that someone has definitely spiked with sherry, and a string quartet that is very determined to play all of Beethoven's lesser-known works. You arrive dressed to impress, naturally, in a gown that could double as temporary housing for a family of 4, thanks to the marvel and mild madness of the steel crinoline. This peculiar little structure, equal parts engineering and elegance, was the cage-like framework worn under skirts to create the desired bell-shaped silhouette. A trend. That said, yes, I do plan to sweep the entire ballroom floor as I walk. Thank you. The advent of the steel crinoline in the mid-19th century marked a turning point from layers of heavy petticoats to a more, shall we say, aerated design. You were no longer weighed down by 5 skirts worth of cloth and expectations. Now you just had to balance a wire dome around your legs without poking the guests' eyes out. Invented around 1856, the steel crinoline, sometimes called the cage crinoline, was not the brainchild of a fashion designer, but rather an engineer. Because, of course, fashion in the Victorian era often required more involvement from metallurgists than milliners. These supportive steel hoops were suspended from the waist in concentric circles, growing larger toward the hem, like a topographical map of Mount Everest for tea parties. The benefit? Freedom, in theory, with less fabric clinging to the legs. Women could finally walk with fewer chances of tripping over excess layers. The downside: one brisk gust of wind and you might find yourself airborne, or at least revealing more ankles than society was quite prepared for. Not that safety was always top of mind. The cage crinoline may have liberated the legs, but it occasionally betrayed them, particularly near open flames. Candle-lit rooms, roaring fireplaces, and poorly timed twirls made a dangerous mix. Flammable fabrics and flouncy silhouettes turned unfortunate waltzes into dance floor disasters. There were even reports, you won't want to hear this before bed, but I'll whisper it anyway, of women tragically having their skirts catch fire while reaching for a glass of sherry or curtsying a little too close to a hearth. One needed style, poise, and also the life skills of a volunteer firefighter. Yet despite these minor inconveniences like spontaneous combustion and spatial unawareness, women clung to the crinoline. Why? Because it was fashion, darling. And fashion, historically, has never required good sense, just great commitment. Some even found unexpected uses for their domed attire. There are cheeky diary entries suggesting women could hide anything from snacks to small pets under their voluminous skirts. Courtship took on acrobatic dimensions too. It's hard to swoon gracefully when you and your partner must shout across several yards of reinforced hoops just to say, "I adore your stitching." The crinoline was also oddly democratic. Unlike previous eras where extravagant fashion was reserved strictly for royalty and the very wealthy, the steel cage was mass-produced, cheaper than its layered predecessors, and available to the middle classes. It meant that suburban housewives could look just as absurdly elegant as duchesses. The line between nobility and neighbor became not so much blurred as equally bell-shaped. Critics, of course, had thoughts. Political cartoons of the time gleefully poked fun at the impracticality of the design, depicting women sweeping men off their feet quite literally, or moving through doorways like majestic, confused umbrellas. Etiquette manuals scrambled to catch up, advising women on how to sit without levitating and how to navigate staircases without declaring war on gravity. Like all grand illusions, the crinoline eventually lost its charm. Fashion tides shifted. Silhouettes softened. Parasols outlived their hoop-skirt cousins. But for one whimsical chapter in the grand saga of style, women ruled the ground with skirts wide enough to command their own postal codes. Some nights, the ghost of the crinoline still rustles through old wardrobes, whispering, "Remember when being fashionable meant not fitting through doors." Now, let us glide gently forward, without knocking over the candelabra, into a quieter moment where the steel may soften, but the stories only grow more curious. As twilight crept over the boudoir of late 18th century Europe, a curious creature began to flutter into the fashion spotlight, the pannier. Not a souffle, not a side dish, but an extraordinary skirt frame that had all the elegance of a sideways teacup and the practicality of a dining room table strapped to your hips. Gone were the days of the modest bell hoop. No. The pannier, named for its resemblance to the baskets once slung over the backs of donkeys, was about to take women's fashion outward, quite literally, to new and improbable dimensions. Imagine, if you will, gently drifting off to a time when walking through a doorway required geometry, or hedging sideways into salons like a polite crab. Panniers weren't just skirts, they were architectural ambitions masquerading as apparel. They demanded strategic spatial awareness and, at grand court gatherings, the turning radius of a schooner. But oh, the grandeur, the spectacle. So how exactly did panniers become the toast of Versailles? Blame it on courtly politics, or perhaps the eternal desire to make an entrance bigger than your rivals. At the court of Louis XV, it was essential not only to be seen, but to be wide enough to block others from being seen at all. Enter the pannier. Women would don these wide, elliptical cages under their gowns and suddenly appear twice as important, 3 times as unapproachable, and roughly the width of a Christmas buffet table. Panniers could span several feet across. Yes, feet. Once, Maria Theresa of Austria wore a dress so enormous it reportedly required 2 ladies-in-waiting to help maneuver her through a ballroom door. Another noblewoman was said to have gotten temporarily lodged in a corridor, like an 18th century Roomba trying to process a tight corner. Of course, this magnificent breadth didn't come without domestic complications. Your average lady of nobility couldn't easily sit down, and when she did, it was often a perch more than a rest, a gentle hover perhaps on the edge of a bench, as though waiting for the next line of a very grand opera. And heaven help anyone trying to ascend a narrow spiral staircase without causing a mild architectural incident. Yet, with all the impracticality of the pannier, it had one charming twist: it accentuated the waist. The enormous side flare made the torso appear daintier, and the face, by contrast, almost mystical. The human eye, confronted by such lateral construction, narrowed naturally to the middle, making the wearer's corseted waist look supernaturally tiny. Fashionable sorcery, in silk and steel. And of course, these garments weren't just for show, they were symbols. The size of one's pannier could reflect the depth of one's social rank, wedding budget, or sheer commitment to impracticality. It was as much a power move as it was a fashion statement. Tailors and dressmakers had to become amateur engineers, designing dresses that could float over these metal or whalebone skeletons with the grace of a summer cloud and 0 entanglements. Dresses came with hidden openings to allow the wearer to reach storage pockets. Yes, secret storage, tucked into the vast acreage of skirt like some majestic, mobile wardrobe Narnia. Interestingly, panniers often only went wide at the sides, leaving the front and back surprisingly flat. This meant that from the side, a pannier wearer looked like any sensible aristocrat might. But rotate 90 degrees, and suddenly you're looking at a woman shaped like a sideways biscuit tin, gliding past tapestries and tea trays with imperial assurance. And while court life glittered with the swish and rattle of these daring frames, the outside world began to murmur. Satirical prints began to circulate, cartoonish sketches of 2 women struggling to pass one another on a city street, or a frustrated gentleman trying to propose marriage over a skirt the size of a garden bed. Fashion, as ever, was being gently roasted by the ink of its less bedazzled observers. But for those privy to the glittering corridors of European courts, these ornate contraptions remained a dreamy emblem of extravagance. Silks twinkled over hand-forged hoops, candles danced in crystal sconces, and social standing could, quite literally, be measured in inches. Let your breath fall soft now, like satin on whalebone. Behind the brocade and bows lies a deeper scene. waiting to be stitched together in time's quiet next chapter, where fashion meets rebellion and the skirts begin to swirl. If there was one thing the Georgian era didn't lack, it was bravado. That, and unnecessarily complicated ways to get dressed. As the 18th century waltzed onward, fashion reached new architectural heights, or rather, widths. The pannier, which had been gaining momentum like a muslin-clad snowball rolling downhill, hit its full, gloriously impractical stride. At its core, quite literally, the pannier was a side-hooped framework, residing under a lady's gown like a secret iron butterfly. It expanded the width of the skirt dramatically, creating what could only be described as a wearable end table. While the front and back remained relatively slim, ladies now glided through parlors like sideways gliders, wide enough to carry tea trays on either hip, and perhaps small diplomatic meetings. The noblewomen of 18th century France, in particular, embraced this silhouette with such enthusiasm that architects may have considered adjusting hallway dimensions accordingly. Sitting down became an advanced maneuver, best executed with precise geometry and a strong poker face. And entering a carriage, a dramatic event involving strategic rotations, bowed heads, and a silent vow to one day wear trousers. Panniers weren't just about width, though. They were about visibility, status, and a good old-fashioned dose of social intimidation. The more pannier you wore, the more important you probably were. Or at the very least, the more you wanted people to think you were. Imagine a grand ball at Versailles, candlelight flickers against crystal chandeliers. The air smells faintly of powdered wigs and political resentment. Dressed in silks adorned with embroidery finer than spiderwebs, the aristocratic guests float between rooms, their side hoops sweeping respectfully large half circles around each other to avoid accidental fencing matches. These metallic looms of fabric became so wide by the 1740s that two women in full dress couldn't pass through a doorway at the same time. Architects took notice. Doors were made wider, chairs restructured. In a way, it was like rearranging a city to accommodate unusually large birds who simply refused to fold their wings. There is, of course, a lingering question that historians have often asked while sipping their tea and studying French portraits. How, exactly, did women in panniers use the restroom? Well, carefully. Or if they were extremely lucky, wealthy enough to have loyal attendants and access to the kind of chamber pots that involved more hope and prayer than precision engineering. Some dresses had cleverly designed slits and underlayers designed to allow for modest navigation. Others simply demanded that nature be rescheduled until further notice, and yet fashion, like a sleepy ferret in a hatbox, is rarely logical. It doesn't ask, can one sit in this? Or, will this cause mild injury during windy weather? No, it asks, will they stare? And, for ladies of the court, if the answer was yes, then by all means, strap on the side hoops and enter the drawing room sideways like a sea crab with royal gossip. It is worth noting that panniers had a brief diplomatic scandal of their own. In 1757, the Spanish ambassador's wife attended a royal function wearing panniers so wide that she allegedly became wedged in a doorway between two staterooms. Several footmen had to assist in extracting her, and one rather nervous dog remained trapped behind her for nearly 15 minutes. To the modern eye, it all seems gloriously absurd. An outfit designed to make you resemble a lane of traffic. But panniers weren't just fashion. They were a form of power. A visible reminder that the woman wearing them took up space. Enough space to make others move aside. And then, as with all fashions that reach their comedic peak, panniers began to shrink. Just a little at first. Like a grand goodbye whispered through bone stays and ballroom echoes. Soon they would evolve, reshape, and be replaced. Sideways volume would slowly give way to rearward majesty. But before we turn the corner into fashion's next corseted conundrum, let's pause here. Close your eyes. Imagine the warm hush of candlelit salons, the gentle creak of whalebone under silk, and the rustle of skirts as two well-dressed ladies attempt, with quiet dignity, to pass through the same doorway. Only one of them will succeed. But will it be the Duchess of Limoges, notorious for smuggling petits fours in her side panniers, or the Countess of Artois, whose hoops whistle slightly when she moves? We'll tiptoe into that intrigue very, very soon. By the mid-19th century, fashionable women had become truly skilled architectural engineers without ever picking up a hammer. Instead, they wielded corsets, petticoats, and most impressively, the crinoline. Ah, the crinoline. An understructure so wide and unwieldy it could politely clear an entire dinner table simply by turning sideways. Now, imagine yourself wrapped in 20 pounds of cloth, perched delicately above a structure made of steel hoops, whale bones, or horsehair, depending on your budget and your affinity for ocean creatures. Designed to puff skirts out like upside-down parasols, crinolines were not so much garments as they were statements. Statements that cried, "Notice me, but do not under any circumstances attempt to sit too close." At first, these fashionable cages were handmade and more like heavy petticoats stuffed with horsehair, or as it was, thrillingly known, crin, hence crinoline. But in 1856, a gentleman named R.C. Milliot patented the cage crinoline, a miraculous creation of spring steel hoops connected by tapes which turned the human body into something roughly the diameter of a small gazebo. Skirts became wider, gravity lost its grip on the lower half of society, and doorways began to seem awfully narrow. But fashion has its price, as do metal contraptions encircling one's lower limbs. Though liberating in the sense that women no longer had to layer 30 pounds of petticoats, the cage had a character all its own. A gentle breeze could become a scandalous affair. A sudden gust might send a lady sailing like an airborne jellyfish into social disgrace. Hoops caught themselves in carriage wheels, embraced furniture legs with romantic enthusiasm, and occasionally knocked over a small child or startled dog. And staircases. How many mistresses of fashion met their downfall, quite literally, on winding staircases tightly curving where crinolines dared not follow? The stylish woman became a master of geometry, swiveling sideways, folding her hoops inward like one might collapse a beach chair, all while balancing etiquette and the fine china on her head. The comedy went well beyond physics. Imagine trying to have a discreet conversation at a ball, while your skirt has captured someone else's chair, lifting it several inches off the ground as you sweep by. Whispers of, "I believe your ladyship has stolen my seating apparatus," might trail behind like gossip in the air. But the crinoline wasn't just a punchline in satin, it carried undertones of changing times. In some curious twist of logic, it was hailed by some feminists as liberating. Yes, liberating. Compared to earlier fashion, where heavy layers clung to skin and spread diseases through poor hygiene, the cage allowed air to circulate and skirts to float off the body like frothy soufflés. It meant fewer layers pressing in, and for the first time, space. Ample, impractical, cart-swinging space. And while it looks like a fashion designed solely for leisure, and, quite frankly, for looking ethereal in oil portraits, working-class women too soon had their versions. Slightly smaller, yes. Less flamboyant, certainly. But still, steel hoops were hooped by all. Yet, fashion does have a flair for dramatic exits. By the 1870s, the full circular form began to narrow. The craze for width moved backward, literally, in the direction of the bustle. Women no longer glided with equal circumference. Instead, they seemed to have fused with a small sofa at the rear. But that, dear sleeper, is a story upholstered for another moment. The crinoline, for its brief reign, turned the female silhouette into something surreal, half woman, half lampshade. It bent iron, society, and doorframes to its will. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was deadly, too. Yes, tragically, crinolines were known to catch fire, particularly when too close to open hearths candles, or any object with a healthy disrespect for fabric. One cannot, after all, mix orbiting skirts with architecture and expect chemistry to behave. And yet, people did, because fashion, like sleep, doesn't always make sense. It's about dreaming big, even if that dream sometimes means spending your afternoon lodged in a turnstile, waving for help between the bars of your own dress. Now, as our skirts begin to rustle into the twilight, let us follow that shifting fabric, away from the hoop's full embrace and toward the curious twitch of the bustle, where fashion didn't so much relax as it politely repositioned itself to the rear. Meanwhile, in the subdued glow of gaslight parlors and candlelit powder rooms, the genteel struggle for elegance carried on, a quiet battle mostly fought while trying not to knock over tea tables with the conical hem of one's undercarriage scaffolding. Yes, our story inches ever forward into one ever forward. Particularly crucial and cringeworthy aspect of the metallic fashion age, the seating situation. Or more honestly, the entire lack of one. Picture it. An 1860s garden party. The air smells of lilac and moral superiority. You're one of many finely dressed ladies, your crinoline skirt flaring wide as a harvest moon. Your host gestures to a charming wrought iron bench. It is wrought. It is iron. But it is not, you quickly observe, wide enough to accommodate you, your skirt, and your deeply rooted fears of social embarrassment. You hover. You pivot. You consider perching like a stork. Meanwhile, the gentleman beside you offers no help, as he is distracted trying to conceal his sideburns' slow migration into ambitious mutton chops. Sitting gracefully in a crinoline was the kind of advanced maneuver that rivaled ballet. Ladies often developed what could only be described as gravity-defying thigh strength, performing a poised squat, part bend, part hover, while fanning themselves, with as much composure as a human can summon while fighting centrifugal force. Upholstery creaked. Petticoats poofed ominously. Occasionally, some poor soul misjudged her angle and ended up folded like a letter, stuck sideways between a fainting couch and the rigid boundaries of fashion. Furniture, you see, did not evolve at the same speed as the human ambition to resemble a walking pastry. Chairs remained narrow and utterly unbothered about your spatial difficulties. Some even had arms, rude little stubs that boxed in a lady like the handles of a sardine can. Thus, many garments of the era came with silent disclaimers. Should you attempt to sit, results may vary. Public transportation was another story. Horse-drawn omnibuses were designed for people, yes, but not for people with horizontal ambitions stitched into their dresses. Many a crinoline-wearing lady discovered that fitting through the door of a public carriage was akin to an ill-conceived trustful. Not all made it in, not all made it out. Some simply hovered in the doorway, much like a ship stuck in harbour, resigned to enjoy the breeze and contemplate life's decisions. But if the sitting was bad, getting through narrow hallways was its own form of comic choreography. Two women approaching from opposite ends would find themselves in a showdown of politeness and physics, a social stalemate, not unlike two peacocks trying to bow at once. Backing up was almost always the safest bet, provided one didn't knock over the cat, a small side table, or Aunt Margaret's prized porcelain shepherdess. Modesty, curiously, was cited as one of the benefits of the voluminous underskirt. With so many yards of fabric between a lady and any outside air, it was considered the fashion equivalent of a burglar alarm. Nothing was getting in or out without extensive protocol. Yet paradoxically, the enormous scope of a crinoline meant the occasional privacy mishap. A stiff wind could turn an idyllic stroll into a lace-ruffled panic, revealing more about one's stockings than would ever be discussed at tea. Entire moral pamphlets were written condemning heavy breezes as a threat to decency, as though the weather itself had developed scandalous intentions. Still, as restrictive as crinolines were, they weren't entirely without their advantages. Tall women, for instance, found their statuesque presence amplified. while shorter women could hide small pets or children among the endless frills. Some used the framework as storage, smuggling in novels, snacks, or the occasional forbidden political pamphlet. Who said fashion and rebellion couldn't share real estate? But perhaps the real marvel is how fully society adjusted. Rooms were built wider. Dance cards were calculated with skirt physics in mind. Whole ballrooms were designed with circular waltzes to accommodate drifting silks and surging waves of embroidered grandeur. There is, oddly, a romance to all this unwieldy elegance, an ode to how far people will go to chase an ideal of beauty, even if it means needing your own zip code under your dress. And as the final decades of the Crinoline era drifted onward, like the skirts themselves, another fashion revolution peeked around the corner, leaner, tighter, and attached perilously to something even less structurally sound than a metal cage, the moral compass of the corset. But that's a tale still just lacing itself up. For now, close your eyes and drift gently, like a hoop skirt on a spring breeze, toward the next gentle turning point in our tale, beneath the flickering candlelight of 18th century ballrooms, where powdered wigs gently bobbed to the strains of violins and social ambition. The panier reigned supreme. This wide architectural wonder of undergarment engineering swept through polite society like a well-heeled hurricane, reshaping not just the silhouette of fashion, but the dimensions of chairs, doorways, and personal space. A panier, pronounced panier, because the French never waste an opportunity to sound sophisticated, was a sort of side-shelf structure worn under skirts, extending the gown horizontally like a polite yet firm elbow saying, "No, you may not sit next to me." Originally inspired by the more demure farthingale of earlier centuries, the panier took things to saucier new territory. It was made using cane, whalebone, metal, or, if your seamstress had a rebellious streak, basket-making materials. The result was something halfway between a wearable fruit stand and a majestic butterfly attempting liftoff. Now you might wonder, why all this effort to look like a well-dressed piece of furniture? It was all about status, darling. A gown that required tiny bridges be built just to escort one through a doorway was a subtle message that one absolutely did not engage in anything as pedestrian as manual labor. If your hips took up 4 feet of conversational real estate, it meant your wealth, lineage, and possibly your opinion of yourself occupied even more. The arrangement wasn't just about width, it was about presence. In a room full of extended skirts, each woman was an island unto herself, unapproachable except by official invitation. Court intrigue had to be waged across expanses of brocade and lace. Gossip often had to ripple from one side of the gown to the other, like whispers conducted by wind through curtains. Walking, of course, was a game of angles and grace. There are diaries and letters, frilled with ink and exasperation, describing the art of passing through doorways sideways, like a cowed but elegant crab. Grand staircases. These became obstacle courses that tested a woman's balance, her patience, and the tight-laced truce she hoped to keep with gravity. Sitting proved to be an activity reserved for the inventive. Special benches were constructed, elegantly scooped like ladles, so panniered backsides could nest within. Carriages required serious modification, and even then, traveling was a high-stakes game of folding oneself like an origami swan made mostly of silk and breathless apologies. Still, many persisted, and they looked fabulous doing it. At the unyielding center of panier diplomacy was Versailles, where women like Madame de Pompadour and Marie Antoinette wore their fabric fortresses with the poise of queens, even when their actual thrones wobbled with the politics of the moment. Though Marie would eventually meet a fate as unenviable as her milliner's invoice, no one could accuse her of doing anything in moderation, especially not accessorizing. But let's not forget the human cost of these wide horizons. Courtiers might flap their fans and drop bon mot, but it was often domestic staff who bore the structural load. Dressers, servants, and starchers knew the hidden truths, like which cage was prone to creak, or which gown could trap half a pheasant unnoticed. There are rumors whispered by fashion historians over ironing boards that one duchess once smuggled a small dog into court via the northern hemisphere of her skirt. These skirts also birthed a subtle choreography of the upper class. Men, meeting a lady wearing 2 yards of socially respected hull, would bow at a distance, measuring their approach like sailors, debating whether to dock at a very expensive island. Courting became a dance of fans, eye contact, and ensuring one's compliments didn't get caught in netting. And occasionally, just occasionally, one would miscalculate. A notable countess fainted dramatically once, not from scandal, but from forgetting she couldn't quite exhale in all that corsetry beneath a particularly ambitious pannier. She was revived with a breeze of lavender water and a discreet reduction in circumference. Eventually, as all fashion does, the pannier yielded to new whims, a narrower dress, a different silhouette, a new corset to skirmish with. But for a time, it was the undisputed champion of impractical elegance. So now rest easy, knowing that you live in a world where walking through a door doesn't require geometry. Drift off picturing ink-stained invitation cards, powdered faces glowing beneath chandeliers, and dresses so wide that friendships had to curve around them like starlight bending in space. Close your eyes. The next step of the journey will arrive gently, just beyond the hem of sleep's velvet skirt. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the gentle end of our most peculiar promenade through the age when a lady's silhouette depended not on posture or potato, but on the height, width, and engineering prowess of the steel cage she was wearing beneath her dress. By the latter half of the 19th century, the mighty Crinoline, once as vast as a harvest moon and capable of taking out side tables in a single swoop, began to deflate. Not with a bang, but with something more like a polite curtsy. The metal undercarriages that once turned drawing rooms into obstacle courses slowly gave way to quieter, more manageable understructures, turning broad circumference into focused volume. Enter the bustle. Ah yes, if the crinoline demanded that polite society walk in wide arcs around its wearer, the bustle declared, "Let us put all the drama in the back, like a well-written mystery novel." A bustle was a sort of architectural rear shelf, padded or wired, perched on a lady's lower back like a smug little shelf for the imagination. It said, "I've left the front of my skirt free for movement, but I've saved the party for the posterior." But even that eventually began to wane. As the 20th century tiptoed in, tired of tripping over petticoats and being stuck in doorframes, fashion tilted toward function. Women began demanding clothing they could actually walk in, ride a bicycle in, perhaps even breathe while wearing. What a concept. By the time World War I came around, crinolines and bustles were shuffled into cedar chests and attics, stored away with yesterday's monogrammed calling cards and the occasional faint smell of lavender sachets and regret. The world was spinning faster now. Trains, telegraphs, and telegrams were rewiring society. Women were moving more, doing more, and expecting their clothing to keep up. Steel cages had met their match in practicality, but let us not judge the lofty silhouettes of the past too harshly. As comically impractical as they now seem, those enormous dresses had a language all their own. They spoke of status, artistry, geometry, and occasionally a strong cross breeze. And who among us hasn't worn something wildly uncomfortable for the sake of looking fantastic at a cousin's wedding? Or perhaps a poorly advised pair of shoes that made you question the entire concept of toes. Fashion, after all, has always been a dance between comfort and spectacle, utility and theatre. The women who wore the crinoline weren't just fashion victims. They were basking in a new kind of movement, a little personal revolution under every hem. With each expanded diameter, they occupied more space in the room. And if men coattailing their way through the corridors of power wore top hats and tailored waistcoats, well, why shouldn't women wear something that required architectural drawings? In many ways, the crinoline era marks a strange intersection of oppression and expression. Steel hoops weren't just fragile cages. They were bold declarations. "Yes," they whispered, I take up space, and I do not apologize. Also, do mind the vase behind me. Today, the spirit of the Crinolines still floats around like an occasional ghost at the fashion feast. You'll catch glimpses in the bell-shaped skirts of bridal gowns and couture pieces that glide more than walk, like ships made of chiffon. Once in a while, a designer looks at fabric and thinks, what if it had scaffolding? And thus, the legacy endures. It's a dreamy thing to imagine. Those evening salons lit by flickering gaslight, the swish of skirts moving by, petticoats like the rustle of paper secrets, and beneath it all, the faint metallic creak of fashion's most impractical, yet undeniably poetic, undercarriage. And now, my dear friend of the night, let your thoughts float as softly as a calico hem in a gentle ballroom breeze. The great fashion odyssey of hoops and humps has tucked itself away into history's wardrobe, and we too shall tuck in. May your dreams drift lightly, unencumbered by wires or whalebone, and your sleep be as smooth as satin trim on a Sunday dress. Good night, lovely listener. Sleep well.